Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Wells. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. This afternoon, I'd like to welcome you to the Brown Bag History Lecture Series, sponsored by the History Department of the University of Nebraska at Kearney. This series is offered in partnership with the Nebraska State Historical Society. Lectures are held on the second Wednesday in selected months at the Kearney Public Library. A schedule for this series, as well as the information about all of the History Department's programs, may be found at www.unk.edu/academics/history. Check it out. Information about all of the Nebraska State Historical Society's programs and services is found at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not a member, I encourage you to join. Benefits of membership include subscriptions to Nebraska History Magazine, use of a microfilm reader and printer in the Society's library archive in Lincoln to make free copies from microfilm, free admission to the Society's 7 historic sites, reduced fees for kids, classes, tours, after-hours events, and similar activities where there is a fee, and discounts to the Society's landmark stores at the History Museum in Lincoln, the state capitol, and at Chimney Rock. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the UNK History Department and the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs, and to the Kearney Public Library for providing this venue. These programs are broadcast by cable partners across the state and are posted on YouTube. UNK and the Society are pleased to be sharing these programs with you. To find these videos on YouTube, it's easy. Type in your browser www.youtube.com/user/Nebraska Historical. Click on Playlist and it will take you to a new page. There you will see a subsection labeled Brown Bag Lectures, where you will find over 160 past brown bags. Our speaker today is Todd von Kampen, a freelance writer from North Platte and author of the 2017 dual biography Ron and Carol Cope, A Nebraska Love Story. Ron and Carol Cope, published for the Cope Foundation by Morris Publishing of Kearney, traces the lives, activities, accomplishments, and generosity of former state senator Ron Cope and his wife Carol Cope, beginning with their Nebraska pioneer grandparents in the late 1800s. The couple, who made Kearney their home after their 1939 wedding, were co-owners for 3 decades of the former Clausen's Shoes and 4 other stores in Kearney, North Platte, Holdridge, and Lexington. They donated an estimated $25 million to local, regional, and statewide causes through Carol Cope's death on her 103rd birthday, September 13th, 2012. With the aid of investments in Buffalo County farmland, other real estate and stocks, especially Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, the Cope Foundation maintains the couple's financial and charitable legacy. Please join me in welcoming Todd von Kampen.
As you can imagine, summarizing a book like Ron and Carol Cope, A Nebraska Love Story in an hour or less is a very huge undertaking, if for no other reason than that Carol Cope in particular lived for so long, 103 years. And their story covers both the breadth of Nebraska, a great breadth of it geographically, as well as much of the history of our state. So there's much, much more to Ron and Carol's story than we can cover here. You can read the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey, the old radio commentator, liked to say, somebody that Carol liked to listen to, by buying the book at the back or going to the Kearney Area Community Foundation website at kearneyfoundation.org and ordering a copy of the book directly from there. But we'll focus today on the communities where the Copes lived and how they shared their lives, because it's in their love of community that Ron and Carol offer lessons for us all. I want to start here with a line in the classic movie Field of Dreams that keeps coming back to me when I think about the impact of Ron and Carol on this community and this state. This line that I'm thinking about is not the famous line, "If you build it, they will come," although that certainly has been the case here in Kearney if you look at all the many community facilities to which the Copes donated and which bear their names. But the line I'm thinking about seems an appropriate one to unpack in light of the Copes' almost endless involvements in Kearney's boards, clubs, and community groups over their 52 years of marriage and Carol's remarkable last 2 decades on her own. Now, if you've seen the movie, you may remember that Kevin Costner, as Ray Kinsella, is driving from Iowa to Boston in search of James Earl Jones, who was playing a one-time 1960s activist named Terrence Mann. Because the same voice that had told Ray Kinsella to build that baseball field on his farmland had told him to ease his pain. At any rate, so Costner gets there, and when he finally confronts Terrence Mann, he asks why he wasn't still involved as he had been in the 1960s. And Jones's character sighs with an exhausted tone and says, "I was the East Coast distributor of involved." Well, you might call Ron and Carol the Central Nebraska distributor of involved, to compare like that. Jones's character had given up just from having to deal with life and human beings and the like. But in real life, what causes people who care about other people and the places where they live to not give up, but to persevere, as Ron and then Carol did until their last breaths of life? It's faith and unselfish love for each other, for one's neighbors, and for the communities that they live in. The Cope Foundation and I settled on the title Ron and Carol Cope, A Nebraska Love Story, because Ron and Carol lived and loved each other and their communities in that way all across this state. We'll be tracing those communities here over the next few minutes. So I'd like to propose, as I do in the last words of my book, that Ron and Carol's story is more than a memorial to the type of community they helped to nurture among 4 generations of Kearney residents. It's also a reminder to this community about what and who made Kearney what it is today. It's a proposal to other communities in Nebraska and beyond about how they can do as Kearney did. And it's a reminder to our state and even our country, as James Earl Jones said later in the movie, about what once was good and could be again. I chose the title for today as The Spaces They Occupied, based on the quotes that I included in the back cover of the book here. The top one is something that Ron said, but he said in public remarks around these parts that I've always believed in and promoted conservation of our greatest resource, the lives of the citizens of Nebraska. But Carol, more specifically, and this was something that she said in a fairly recent speech in 2006 about her beliefs in philanthropy, that I've always believed service is the price we pay for the space we occupy in this world. And that is where the many communities that they were part of comes from. So you will see Kearney obviously in the middle there, and the communities nearby, North Platte, Lexington, and Holdridge, which are also part of their business lives. We mentioned, or will be mentioning, about Ron's work as a member of the unicameral legislature from District 36, 1975 to 83, and of course they spent much time in Omaha, as many of us do. But our story will begin there in that southeast corner of Nebraska, specifically Pawnee County. And so this is where the opening half of the book, the majority of it, takes place, because this was from where both Ron and Carol sprang and from where they began to learn their lessons of community. Pawnee County was founded about a decade before statehood, and as it happened, the action in their lives focuses on communities that are basically on or near that internal triangle which is formed by the state highways down there in that county, which is, by the way, west of Falls City and southeast of Beatrice, and due south of Omaha on Highway 50. So you can kind of tell the locations, the communities of Burchard, Tate, which no longer exists, Steiner, and Pawnee City, and also the locations of a couple other important parts of the story: Goodview Farm, southeast of Burchard, which is where Ron grew up, and the site of a significant car accident in Carol's family that led to the death of her mother in 1936, and which directly contributed to their interest in founding the Nebraska Safety Center here at UNK. A quick look through the home country of where they came from. As you can see, Burchard is actually known as the birthplace of Harold Lloyd, one of the best-known silent film stars of the 1920s. But it is also where our love story really starts, because it was a high school on that location. It burned down in 1938, and this one here took its place. But that's the high school where Carol and Ron met, graduated, taught, and started dating. So Burchard's very important to the story, and so is the site that once was Tate. It's northwest of Burchard, but this is where Carol was born, and her father, Frank Schreppel, had a blacksmith shop, and where she went to country school. It was one like those many towns in Nebraska that were founded on a railroad line that went through. It briefly flowered, then the railroad line went away, and over time so did the town. And these days there is no trace left of Tate. Steiner is very much still with us, and it was the site where Frank Schreppel first began working as a blacksmith, also where he met his wife Lena. And it's St. Anthony Catholic Church in that community where Ida Schreppel, and we'll talk more about that as we go along, was baptized, and that's also where Carol's parents and Ron and Carol themselves were married over time. And finally, Pawnee City, the county seat. And though I will not be spending much time on this subject today, I do want to give a shout out to Carol's brother, Art Schreppel, who was one of the legendary figures in Nebraska high school music education during his years at Pawnee City High School from 1931 to 1967. He was a co-founder of the two major organizations for music educators in Nebraska, the NMEA and also the State Bandmasters Association. His bands were incredibly large for a small school. He got superior ratings 33 consecutive years at contest, and his band was chosen to represent Nebraska at the 1965 World's Fair in New York City. So he was a very influential figure in music, and as you'll see, music is a very important subplot to the Cope story. Very quick look at some of the parents and grandparents here, the ones that are most significant. In the upper left hand, you'll see Ron's grandparents, James A. Cope Sr. and Eleanor Stewart Cope. Eleanor was the third wife of James A., and he is where our story, my story, actually begins, because he grew up in Wisconsin, in Ohio, and then moved to Wisconsin. But when the Civil War broke out, he joined the 12th Wisconsin Regiment of the Union Army, which then fought for 3 years in the Western Theater of War and was part of General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea. James A. Cope was very proud of his service, and it led to later inspired World War II service for some of Ron's brothers. We'll speak about that more in a little while, but it's also significant because James A. Cope Sr. was a member from 1885 to 1889 of the lower house of Nebraska's original two-house legislature. So there is some symmetry in public service between himself and his grandson Ron, whom he unfortunately never knew as he passed away in 1893. At lower left are Ron's parents, Lon Cope and Maud Smith. And at right are Carol's parents, Lena Pettinger was her maiden name, and Frank Schreppel. And one of the very interesting coincidences in the family is that both of them, although they did not know each other at the time, were married on exactly the same day, June 21st, 1905, in different parts of Pawnee County. And so, again, all these threads that keep coming back for us here. This is a quick look at Goodview Farm. James A. Cope bought this property in 1883. It was actively farmed by the Cope family until Lon died of a heart attack in 1950. 5 years later, they sold it. The land is still actively farmed, but the buildings are now all gone, unfortunately. But I did visit the site, and you could still see remnants of where this happened. And this also is interesting because in later life, when Ron bought farmland north of here in Buffalo County, the site that he first bought up by Pleasanton, Nebraska, reminded him so much of his home place that he grew up on that he named it also Good View Farm 2. So there's the connection. As for the blacksmith shop and home of Frank Schreppel, as I noted, it no longer exists, but you can see a couple of pictures. And there's our first look at the woman who was born, Ida Ernestine Schreppel. We did not know when we began, because so much time had passed, that Carol Cope was not always Carol. This was her birth name. She was named most likely for Frank's sister, who was the first Ida Schreppel. And she also, as it happened, Ron had an aunt with the first name of Ida. So she lived with this name for about 30 years, and so I'm going to speak of Ida over the next few minutes, and then you'll see kind of the point at which we transfer over to her identity as Carol. But she went to the country school that was nearest to Tate and graduated from there. She then followed her brother Art to St. Anthony Academy, which was a Catholic high school in Steiner. It's unfortunately long gone. Art graduated from there, but after Carol's junior year, the school closed down. And so at that point, she transferred to Burchard High School for her senior year, which becomes obviously critical to the rest of our story. She then entered Peru State in 1927, and back then you could go to school at a teacher's training school like Peru State or like Kearney State was originally, earn your first level teaching certificate. It qualified you to teach in a country school. Then you could go back, you could earn higher certificates and improve yourself and keep working that way. So Carol took this gradual approach. Eventually, after 5 years of teaching in schools in Pawnee County, she went back to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln and finally earned her bachelor's in music education in 1934 in the keyboard. Ron, as you'll note, was younger than Carol by about 20 months. He was the oldest of 5 children, and you'll see them there. He went to a country school closer to Goodview Farm and graduated from there. When Ida came to Burchard in 1925 as a 15, soon becoming 16-year-old senior, Ron was a 14-year-old sophomore. He would graduate with the class of 1928, and then after a year working on the farm, he went to Peru, and he earned his initial certificate, and he never actually went back from there. But that did not ever dissuade him from being highly interested in education. So Carol and Ron were actually young once, and I think it's a fun reminder when you look at these pictures from their senior sneak trips that young people in the 1920s were not that much different from those that we are seeing about to see in 2020. And so at the left, Ida is sticking out there on the far right behind the head of the young woman in the front row. And Ron, you can perhaps recognize a little more readily, is in the front row of the picture from his senior sneak trip in 1928. But here is some really revealing things about both of them. Ida, or Carol, was known to people in Kearney as a very refined, very reserved, introverted kind of person. And this gives some evidence that to some degree that was a learned trait, because she would castigate herself in letters and things she wrote for herself in those young years and even later about having been a bit more impetuous. And you can see that in her entry in her senior yearbook. Why does everyone expect me to be good? Then we see over here the evidence of the first meeting between Ron and Carol, or Ron and Ida. We can't actually say it was the first meeting because that's lost to history, but this is the first recorded evidence of their knowing each other. So Ron writes, "Dear Ida, although I have known you only 1 short year, you have always been a good friend. I wish you success in the future, your friend Ronald Cope." Another one of those great coincidences, Carol's mother, Lena Schreppel, going to school in Steiner in the 1890s, had a young Frank Schreppel, who was starting in the blacksmith business, write in her autograph book and come to marry her many years later as well. So then Carol goes on to Peru State. We've kind of grouped these pictures into one slide in this particular case, but as you'll see, Ida went for 1 year, then she went out to teach, then she came back, and she just missed Ron in terms of being on campus, but they actually both attended a summer session in 1932, and they were already dating by that time. But you can see an example of some of Ida's activities and some of her friends. You see she was already very musically inclined, also wrote for the student newspaper, the Peru Pedagogian, about music, and so she pursued her music that way. After she attained her first level teaching certificate, she then went to District 24 in Pawnee County and taught for a year. And one of those young girls up there, her name was Carol Prine, P-R-I-N-E. We don't exactly know why she chose Carol later on as a new first name, but there was another student named Carol that she taught a couple years after this. And our best guess is it was a name that she kind of liked, and there were too many Idas in the family, and she just didn't like Ida as a first name. She did keep it as a middle name. As for Ron, after he got his certificate at Peru in 1930, he then taught in two of different country schools in Pawnee City, and one of them is still preserved on the grounds of the Pawnee City Historical Society and Museum down in Pawnee City. Here's a look at Ida, again, as teaching at Burchard School after she got her 2-year degree from Peru State. For 3 years then, she went back to the school where she had graduated from and taught grades 4 to 6 and all of the music. And that included the responsibility for putting on operettas. And you'll see that the one that she put on in 1932 called The Melting Pot, it was a case of where she assembled a lot of folk music and wrote the script herself. Several years later, when teaching in North Platte to a similar group of students, she would present this same operetta, The Melting Pot, once again in 1938. And you also see another theme coming out in her life from the quote that I've included, the theme of faith. She was a Catholic all her life. She was very devoted from the earliest of ages. And this is testified to by a gentleman named Ed Pepperell, who died about a year or two ago, but I was fortunate enough to interview as I started my research process. He actually was a student first of Ida and then of Ron at Burchard School. And so it may have been another era in terms of interaction of public school teachers with the religious matters, but you could see from reading the quote, she wanted to make certain that the Catholic students made it to their 40 hours devotion, and she actually showed him where to go to Sacred Heart Church in Burchard to take part in that. Where did it start for them? It started, as she says, in 2000, and this was from a private writing that she did for herself. I met my best friend and future husband at an alumni banquet at Burchard, Nebraska High School, June 13th, 1931. That was the beginning of lifelong friendship and love. We do not have much of what Carol wrote to Ron personally, but what made it possible for us to tell the story of these earliest years was two major discoveries among the 160 boxes of material she left behind. One of them was a cache of Ron's love letters to Ida, who then became Carol, starting in about 1932 and going up to just before their marriage, except for the years that they were both in North Platte, when they obviously had no reason to write each other like that. But the second find was that Carol kept a diary with very few interruptions from the beginning of 1932 all the way until the middle of 2008, 75 years. There was only one annual edition missing, that of 1966, in what we found. Carol was not a person who revealed a great deal of herself emotionally in her writings, but we get just enough about the important things in their lives and that we are able to actually put the story together. And the letter that Ron sent her at Christmas of 1933 recalls what we know of as their first known date. Remember how we spent the holidays for the last 2 seasons? I'm going to miss going to church with you on Christmas Eve. And say, old dear, remember the first New Year's at Hutchinson's when it was at least 20 degrees below and snowing like the very deuce? So that was where we know it started, but they reacquainted with each other, now in their early 20s, at this alumni banquet that you see a picture of preserved at the right. Just a few pictures as we go along from highlights of their courtship. This would be in the years when they were both still in Burchard. Carol was, in that first year they were dating in 32, was finishing her third and last year teaching at Burchard School. Ron was still teaching country school, but they obviously had some fun experiences together at that point. And then in that fall, then Ida entered NU at last to finish her music degree. Meanwhile, Ron, he didn't actually take Carol's place because Carol had another friend who was the name of Musetta Campbell. And she is actually also known to literary people in Nebraska from recent years because she married a man named Harold Gilman, and it was as Musetta Gilman that the former Miss Campbell wrote a book called Pump on the Prairie, which was about her husband's pioneer family and the Pony Express and Oregon Trail Road Ranch that they ran in the area southeast of North Platte. Musetta also left Burchard School when Carol did, and Ron actually took her place teaching grades 7 and 8 and then became the junior high basketball coach. And so there you get a little taste of Ed remembering what Ron was like. We had a class in agriculture, he says, and one of the questions was, what is hogging down corn? Well, I put down, for his answer, that the hogs were eating so much, they choked to death. Ron ran through the class and he says, Ed, you're a farmer. That stuck with him all his life. Here's a little taste of what Ida did when she was on campus until graduating in 1934. She had a keyboard professor of some note in this state named Wilbur Chenoweth. He was at the university through the end of the 1930s, but he is best known in that time for writing the second fight song of the Huskers, Hail Varsity. But he taught Carol her piano and organ, and she had her senior recital basically at Pawnee City at Christmas time in 1933. And the other activity I would call attention to here is her induction into the National Music Sorority, which still exists, known as Delta Omicron, because this would become an important thing in her life later on. She graduated in 1934. It was the height of the Dust Bowl. It took Carol 4 long months to find a job at that time. And the school year had actually begun when finally she got a call back from one of the school districts that she had initially contacted and had been told that their positions had been filled. The North Platte Public Schools had a position suddenly open, and so they asked Carol to come out and take it. And so that's when she rushed out and at October of 1934 began teaching there. Now, as you will note, North Platte already had significance in her family because in the first years after the Union Pacific established their division point at North Platte in 1866, it happened that Carol's grandfather, a man named Louis Schreppel, landed in the community and worked as a gunsmith from there for 4 years. Family lore says that Buffalo Bill Cody was one of his customers, and though we couldn't quite prove that, it's highly likely because Louis did have a thriving trade up and down the UP line, and he was the only gunsmith in town as long as he was there. But it was in North Platte that Carol's father, Frank Schreppel, was born in the announcement that you can read in the upper right, December 22nd, 1875. And then the family moved on at that point in 1878 into the Colorado mines, and Louis was serving people there until his wife died. He couldn't take care of his 3 children anymore, so he shipped them back to Pawnee County to his wife's parents, and we never hear of Louis Schreppel ever again. He just kind of disappears from history and from the knowledge of Carol's family. So it's to a much newer North Platte that Ida Schreppel returns. She was hired as a classroom and music teacher for 3rd and 4th grades at the former Roosevelt School, which was on the north side of the UP tracks. And that lasted for about a year when she got the job she really wanted to have, being a full music teacher at North Platte's Junior High School that used to stand in the downtown area where the current Wells Fargo Bank is. Finally, in 1937-38, she returned to Roosevelt, this time as the principal. That was her last full year of teaching and the highest position that she ever held. There's a significant group in her history that just disbanded in North Platte a year ago. It was called Monday Musicale. And while it was similar to Delta Omicron in that it was made up of females who were professionals in music and teaching or otherwise, and it was something that allowed them not only to perform for each other and for the community, but to continue learning about music. You can understand why Carol was attracted to something like this. And so she was just literally moving into her first apartment when the ladies that founded Monday Musicale first got together. But at their very first regular meeting, Miss Ida Schreppel was there, as you can see on the upper part of that, accompanying one of the people. A couple months later, though, all of a sudden, you look at the next newspaper item, and you see Miss Carol Schreppel. And that is where she started trying on this new first name. And she would gradually use it with more and more settings until by the time she moved out away from North Platte, she was known exclusively as Carol Schreppel, although it would not become official until she said I do to Ron a number of years later. Well, Ron was very disappointed about having to live so far away from Carol, and he couldn't take it anymore. So in August of 1935, they took a month-long trip driving all the way out to Los Angeles and San Diego for the Golden Gate, or the California Pacific International Exposition. All the evidence, by the way, indicates they did stay in separate rooms. They were perfect young gentleman and young lady. But when they came back, Ron stayed in North Platte this time. And that's where his connections to Kearney began to take shape, because he joined the old O'Connor 5, 10, and 25-cent store located at 4th and Dewey Streets in North Platte in the Elks building. The site is now occupied by Hirschfeld's clothing store, which itself is a 100-year business in North Platte. And it happened that the O'Connor store was right across 4th Street from the junior high where Carol was teaching. Very convenient. He only stayed at the Five and Dime through the Christmas season, but that was long enough to get the attention of a one-time traveling shoe salesman from Beatrice by the name of Reuben J. Clausen, who happened to be a partner of Walter J. O'Connor, the founder of the 3 O'Connor stores there. The left hand had a drugstore and also a department store. And so Reuben liked what he saw in Ron and asked him to transfer over to the department store where he could manage the shoe department and learn the shoe business. And so Ron did that for the next 2 years, from 36 to 38, until finally Reuben asked Ron to come to Kearney and open up a freestanding shoe store for him downtown on Central Avenue in exchange for Ron being not only the manager, but a co-owner. And so the Clausen Shoes was born on March 4th, 1938, and it would remain operating into the mid-1990s, a quarter century after the Copes retired from it. Well, Ron had more, even though it meant moving away from Carol, Ron had more interest in that, in taking that, because he thought this is, as he told her in a letter a few months later, a means to an end. And the end was for them to finally make their life together. So on Mother's Day 1938, he proposed. And they set the wedding, notice, for only about 6 weeks later. But that June 21st date, you will recall from earlier in our discussion, because that was the date that their parents had had. However, Carol quickly changed her mind about getting married so soon. Part of it was because Ron was baptized a Protestant, and while the Catholic Church today recognizes most Protestant baptisms, generally they made you go through another baptismal ceremony at that time, and they couldn't get things organized in time. So Ron was baptized here at St. James Church in the summer of 38, but they had to reset the wedding date, and they set it for exactly a year later, June 21st, 39, which they kept, but not without a lot of drama that I hope you'll buy my book and read about. In the meantime, Carol had to take another job. She'd given up her principal's job in North Platte. In those days, when you were married, you couldn't teach anymore as a female. So she took a teaching job in Lincoln, But she did not have a very good fall and spring. She didn't really get along with the principal there. Again, they were dating long distance, and there was this other problem. There was a late suitor that had surfaced back in North Platte, a fellow by the name of Cleet Reinmiller, who had been a classmate of hers and a fellow member of the Newman Club at UNL. And then he had just gotten a job at North Platte's experiment station, what we now know as the West Central Nebraska Research and Extension Center. He was an animal scientist. And they had dated rather casually, although apparently, even though Ron and Cleet had apparently met each other, according to Carol's diary, neither one of them knew about Carol's role in the other's life, which is kind of strange. But Cleet put on the full court press in the fall of 1939, and Carol had to fend her off. For details, read the book. She finally told him no definitively at the end of 1938, but she was very, very stressed by then, and she was desperate for a change. And the other thing was, there was a dream that she had had, and she had probably had to put it off throughout the years. But Art Treppel, her brother, had once had a dream of playing leading orchestras for silent film pictures. Then they invented talkies. That was the end of that. But Carol also had been mesmerized by the movies, which you can imagine. They probably saw some Harold Lloyd films back in Burchard. And she wanted to be a professional piano accompanist for the Hollywood stars. And so somewhere in the start of 1939, she got the idea, I need to get out of here, and if I'm ever going to make this, have a chance to realize this dream, it's now or never. And so she arranged for a classmate from NU who had already gone out to LA to invite her to start a piano studio with her. And when the friend obliged, all of a sudden she's off to Pasadena in late February 1939. It's less than 4 months to that wedding date, and poor Ron is left in Kearney trying to figure out what's going on. Well, it didn't work out for Carol. There was no interest from the Hollywood stars. They were never able to get the piano studio going, even though they had that ad that appeared in the local chamber orchestra series program. So then she fell back to a plan B, which was, okay, well, maybe I'll take my master's degree in piano at USC, University of Southern California. Maybe I can get their attention that way. She got through one lesson, and then she got really sick. And we will find that that kind of sickness would recur throughout her life. But she, by the end of May 1939, now less than a month before the wedding date, she is prostrate and just really can't do anything. She had not told Ron what was going on with her. When she finally did, you'll see what happened. This is what ran in the Kearney Daily Hub of June 6, 1939. R.J. Cope, manager of Clausen's Shoe Store, left Sunday for a business and vacation trip to California. He will be gone about 2 weeks. He went to bring her home and drove for less than 3 days, drove that entire distance off to California, and he convinced her to come home, and after taking a pre-wedding honeymoon trip up to San Francisco for another one of those World's Fair type things, they made it back to Pawnee County just in time to be married on June 21st, 1939. And then, as it says, the couple will live in Kearney, and they made their home. These are some of the places that Ron and Carol lived. In fact, these are all the places that Ron and Carol lived, all of which, except for this one in the lower right, still stand. There was a parking lot next to a business building at 30th and Street and 2nd Avenue. So you can kind of follow from the start in the middle and kind of go around that way to see how that went. Well, they jumped into civic life pretty quickly, but just 2 years after their marriage, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And of course, everybody's lives was changed by that. In Ron's case, he tried really hard to enter the service. He volunteered twice and was drafted once, but every single time he failed the physical. He had had an arm injury working for his father back on Goodview Farm. He apparently also had color blindness. And anyway, even though they took his 2 brothers, they didn't take Ron. He was assigned to the home front, so he kept working at Clausen's and dealing with the customer's shoe stamps for rations when they came in. Carol, however, had a lot more to do. She was helping Ron at the store already to begin with because salesmen were going off to war, but she also was part of 2 very important causes. She was a senior hostess with the USO base that was here because Kearney had an Army Air Base established at the site of the current Kearney Airport. And so Carol would oversee younger women who would go to the USO Club or some of the other dances that were held, and they would dance with and befriend the soldiers. So Carol wasn't one of those people doing that kind of befriending herself. She saved that for her other task, which was when she volunteered to be a gray lady, basically a nurse's aide with the American Red Cross. And so she worked at the airfield doing this for a couple of years. She was a Red Cross volunteer for more than 70 years, and she also put this kind of training to work when she worked with the Hospital Service League at Good Samaritan Hospital here in Kearney. And you can kind of see what she had to say about that experience, and this was something that she recalled not too long before Ron's death, about a quarter century ago, when she said this. Well, the war was over, and so at that point they could start to grow Claussens, and that was outlined for you earlier, that eventually they bought Famous Shoe Store, which was across Central Avenue and a block south. It's now inside the furniture store on the other side between 22nd and 21st on Central. They opened Claussen stores in Holdridge and in Lexington, and they became partners in the original store where Ron got started back in North Platte. People remembered their personal service, how much interest they took in people. They also remembered an X-ray machine that was used to try to fit people's feet and probably wasn't the smartest thing in the world to do, but it was very popular at the time. And so they kept the stores, their interests, along with Reuben Claussen's widow, Louise, until they sold their stores in February of 1970. They were not able to have children of their own. They did have Carol's Aunt Kate living with them here from the end of the war until she died, but she had ovarian cancer in 1948 and had to have a hysterectomy. They then tried to adopt in 1952, but they were already into their 40s and it just didn't work out. So they made Kearney in general their family, although you can see two particular people who were very important to them. Robert Wiest grew up in Kearney and was a shoe salesman at Claussen's. He could have run one of Ron's stores. He decided to go to seminary instead. Ron and Carol supported him financially and personally all the way through seminary, and they continued to be close to them. He celebrated the funeral mass for Ron in 1992 and died in 98, and he called Ron his second father. The other lady at left was born Mary Lee DeWolf. I did have the opportunity to interview her. She's lived in Minneapolis for the last 25 years. She was their goddaughter, but we know that Carol and Ron considered her as much more than that, and the best sign of that fact is that Carol had acquired a beloved Steinway grand piano in 1939. When she died, it went to Mary Lee. That's how you know how important she was. As I mentioned, they were the Central Nebraska distributors of Involved, and this is just a very long list of the things, some of the many things that Ron did. He was president of the Kearney Chamber of Commerce in 1960. Knights of Columbus, Red Cross, he campaigned successfully in 1957 for the Kearney High School building up on the hill. That was just recently replaced in 2016, and no sooner had Ron and Carol helped to persuade voters to build the public high school that they turned right around and helped lead the campaign to start the Catholic high school in the community. So they have important roles in both Kearney High School and Kearney Catholic High School. They did not care about the public versus parochial school debate. All education at all levels was important to them. As for Carol, she rose as high as first vice president of the state for the Business and Professional Women's Club, and she was involved in the community concert movement. As you can see, she co-founded the Kearney State chapter of Delta Omicron as well as an alumni chapter, and she rose to national second vice president of Delta Omicron in the 1960s. The Kearney Women's Club was her very first club here in town. She joined that in 1940. She was twice its president. She remained a member for 72 years until her death. And they were also very important figures in the Republican Party in the state and in Buffalo County. Ron was the county chairman for 7 years. He got Barry Goldwater to come to town campaigning for Nixon 4 years before Goldwater himself ran for president. And in 1960, Ron was rewarded for his services already by being named one of Richard Nixon's presidential electors. Nixon won the state, though he lost to John F. Kennedy nationally, so Ron got to go to the Capitol and cast one electoral vote for Richard Nixon and his running mate, Henry Cabot Lodge. As for Carol, she was vice chairman of the entire state party in the early 70s, and she led the Buffalo County Republican Women 4 different times, the last time when she was 97 years old. So they were very involved. And you see a picture of when they were sitting in Vice President Nixon's office in 1960 when they were visiting the nation's capital. Well, they retired in 1970, but there never was really such a thing as retirement for them. And that's where their involvement with Kearney State College began. They had secretly established a endowment fund to support student recruiting at Kearney State. And Ron, as executive vice president of the Kearney State Foundation, did everything he could to start building things up. You also can see Carol with some of her other organizations there. In 1974, Ron finally decided, I'm going to run for office. The one and only office that he ever sought in his life was to be in the unicameral. But he had no sooner announced than 5 weeks later he had a major heart attack, the first of several over the last part of his life. His friends, however, rallied to campaign for him, and the sense of his service and how they regarded him as such that he won the primary anyway and then moved on to the unicameral legislature. He served for 2 terms. He was on the Appropriations Committee, where he served with the great Senator Jerome Warner for 6 years, and he also continued to fight for Kearney State. He had 5 major accomplishments in the legislature. LB 309 was the first time that Nebraska had ever started doing preventive maintenance of its state buildings. We still have an LB 309 committee. It still saves the state several $1 million a year because of Ron's foresight. He established a Nebraska Safety Center at Kearney State College, having to battle twice with vetoes by Governor Jim Exon. The second time it was overridden. He helped to designate the Nebraska Art Collection at UNK, which became the foundation of this community's Museum of Nebraska Art. He was the father of the lodging tax, at least he started the idea. And then finally in 1981, he was already working on a bill to require that buildings have smoke detectors when the Holiday Inn here in this town caught fire in the middle of January, and the next day, his bill was already ready to go. He introduced it, he had the perfect excuse, and they got it through. Well, he retired again in 1983, but as you can see, not really. They just had more activities, and you can see an example of those. Carol served on the Nebraska Commission of the Status of Women for 3 years, and that's when it was only then, in their 70s, that they started investing in a little company called Berkshire Hathaway. When they bought their first shares in 1982, it was worth $700 a share. By the time that they finished buying them, the shares were $68.60. By the time Carol died, they were worth about $150,000 a share, and they had 365 of them. That is why they were able to give. They had done well with the shoe stores. They had done well with farmland, but it was really the Berkshire shares that allowed them to do what they did. And that is how the Ron and Carol Cope Foundation continues their work today. You can see some of the buildings that Ron and Carol helped to get going while they were both still living. Their own church, naturally, St. James, but they helped lead the campaign that bought the old Kearney post office to found Mona. They helped to found the YMCA. She helped with the Women's Club home. And Ron lived long enough to see Kearney State transformed into a UNK July 1st, 1991. 6 months later, he had his last heart attack and passed away at the age of 81. You can see some of the attention, including a resolution that the legislature passed. Here's kind of an example of what he was. Ron was a futurist, William Nestor, the first chancellor of UNK, said at his funeral. A visionary for the Kearney community and the state of Nebraska. For Ron, everything that looked to the future elevated human nature. The present, the status quo, did not satisfy him, as he believed that the ideal lay somewhere ahead of him and his time. Carol was heartbroken, beyond normal. It was only in the late 1980s that they discovered that she suffered from clinical depression. She had had several episodes of this over the years, going back to UNL, and definitely including her time in California. She was distraught for about 2 years, and her friends had to help her through that. Finally, they were able to get the right medication, and when they did, it set off an incredible final act. For the last 20 years of her life, she took over completely the Central Nebraska franchise of Involved. And here's just a quick example of the breathtaking final act she put on. I'll just let the slides speak for themselves while I note that she wrote down a list at about the turn of the millennium that had a list of 40 organizations on it. She was a member actively of about 20. She had belonged to 10 others. She still belonged to 10 others, and there had been 10 others she had been part of. She put people 60, 70 years younger than herself to shame because she loved her community. Ironically, as I continued to do that, to flip through these, she wasn't sure she wanted to come live in Kearney at the time when she had run off to California. And in one of those last love letters that he wrote her, trying to persuade her to still marry him and come home, Ron said, "Incidentally, did I tell you that Kearney is a pretty good place to live?" But at the end of her life, she was considered, as you see her role with building Ron and Carol Cope Stadium at Foster Field, she was considered, as Denny Plotchek of the YMCA did, considered the mother of Kearney. She didn't slow down really until her final year of life. And on September 13th, 2012, her friends gathered at her home to give her one last birthday party. She was in the living room in a hospital bed. They all got to say goodbye. One of her friends, who was a pianist, played the song she loved the best. The party broke up at 8:30 p.m. on September 13th, 2012. An hour and a half later, she was gone. She stuck around for one last party. I leave you with a couple of these particular quotes here, and I hope that you've seen the impact of communities on what made them what they were. You can stick to anything you set out to do, Ron told Carol 3 weeks before the wedding, and I love that more than anything else. It's different with me, Carol. I'm mill running humans, and this is how much it means to be with you. And then, as William Nestor said again at Ron's funeral, rarely do we see two people who complement each other so completely. They were indeed the role models par excellence for committed community leadership and service. Ron and Carol did not make Kearney the community it is by themselves. They had a lot of help. They represent the generations of people that they served alongside. They lived long enough to become an image of it. But they show what unselfish love, always putting other people first, can mean for communities across the state. This is what makes Nebraska, anywhere you are, a place worth being from, a place worth going back to, even if you have to leave your part of the state or the state itself to get some experience and come back. I would encourage that of every community in Nebraska, that they can learn from the example of Ron and Carol Cope, and that their love story is a love story for all of us, and indeed for any two people who believe that love is stronger than death. I thank you for your time today.
You said 160 boxes.
More or less.
Where did you put all that while you were doing the research?
Well, the boxes started in Sherry Morrow's garage up in the north part of town. About a month or so after Carol had passed away, I think, it was Sherry and Carol's other younger friends gathered at 4622 Park Lane Drive to start clearing things out. And they had a dumpster outside, and they started throwing things away. And as Sherry tells the story, it was in the middle of that she started realizing just how much material there was there. And she threw up the stop sign, "Don't throw anything more away." So most of those boxes, some of them were already filled by Ron and Carol. Ron's unicameral records were among them, of course. But mostly they just filled them on the spot, and they sat in their garage until people would tell Sherry, "You need to write a book, you need to write a book." And Sherry says, "I don't know anything about writing a book." So she contacted the University of Nebraska Foundation, where one of the writers there, Colleen Kenny Fleischer, happens to be a former University of Nebraska schoolmate and Daily Nebraskan and World Herald colleague of both my wife Joan and myself. So Sherry asked Colleen if she would be interested in writing the book, and this was in late 2013. Colleen said, "I'm busy, but I know somebody who would be interested." So she gives Sherry my phone number, and she calls me. I come down here in mid-December of 2013 to kind of check things out, and as I noted to you at the start, if we had just had nothing else to go on, this would have been a very small but important book about the philanthropic projects that they had done. Then Sherry took me to the garage. It was mid-December and the garage was unheated. I wasn't staying in there for very long, but I peeked open to just enough boxes to see there was some junk and there was some gold. We didn't know how much of each, but there was sure a lot of it. And so I proposed to Sherry and the late Al Oldfather and his son Bill at the foundation, if you're willing to support me and pay me for the time it takes to go through all of this, we might have a story that's far beyond Kearney. And they were gracious enough to do that. And so it turned into a 3.5 year project to process all that material and eventually come up with the book. I ended up ferrying them about 15, 20 boxes at a time in my mid-sized car back from Kearney to Omaha, where I still lived. And then in the middle of the project, as I was nearing the end of 2 years of culling and saving stuff on computer disk, my wife Joan, who has been a journalist with me the whole time and had been at the Omaha World Herald the whole time we were there, I was the victim of a layoff in 2009 after 10 years, was named the managing editor at the North Platte Telegraph. It's one of the papers that we had both worked at before, and West Central Nebraska is our home country. I'm from Ogallala, she's from Scottsbluff. And so we moved to North Platte in the middle of the project, and I was frantically scanning the last 2-3 months we were there trying to sell the house so I didn't have to move dozens and dozens, it was down to about 24 boxes at the time. I got it down to 5 before we finally moved with my 2 youngest kids. She had to start sooner than that. But it was a very fortuitous thing because I had already done one research trip in North Platte. I don't think I could have justified a second one financially, but by moving there, I had plenty of time to go back to the library, and that's when I was able to dig out the story about Louis Schreppel, the gunsmith, and his role in Pioneer North Platte. It made the book a lot better. Ultimately, everything went to the Buffalo County Trails and Rails Museum. And there were there was kind of 3 stages. Obviously, I was looking for material in their papers, in their photos, in their slides, even 2 hours of home movies that would help me to tell the story. There was also a lot of very routine business, family letters and other documents from the organizations they were in that didn't really reflect anything Ron and Carol were doing. So I scanned several dozen gigabytes worth of material, which helped me again to put this PowerPoint together. And I carefully coded and bagged all of that. I also did preserve in plastic bags the material that I did not choose to scan, but generally labeled those. So Trails and Rails has those too. And in the end, I would say it was about 95% gold and 5% junk, although some of the junk was really, really interesting. Obviously, there were many personal items left behind at their death, and these items also live at Trails and Rails, along with quite a bit of the Cope's other personal effects. Most of that is material that comes from Clausen Shoe Store. You see one of the fitting stools that they used, and if you get really close up to that, you'll see that they can actually measure your foot in terms of width and length when you put your foot up there. We also have a display of many of Carol's medals and stickers and pins and such from her 70-plus years in the Red Cross. And the sign that says Senator Cope is the sign that hung over Ron's office when he represented the 36th District from 1975 to 1983. If you've been to the state capitol, they make one of those wooden signs when you come in. Whichever office you're in, they slip that over the top of the door. When you leave, they take it out and they give it to you. If you go to Doug Christensen's office as UNK Chancellor, you will see his sign from when he was Speaker of the Legislature before he took the UNK job here. Thank you very much for your time.